experience in transportation, 13 years with the state DOT, 22 years with the Federal Highway Administration, and 3 years with consulting firms. So today I'm going to provide some training on the materials certification portion of the closeout process. And as we often do, we're going to start with a few pre-test questions just to see what you already understand about the material certification part of the closeout process. Tiffany will publish the poll questions and you should see a pop-up on your screen. You should also see them in the chat pod, so you can answer either in the pop-up or the chat pod, whichever you prefer. So the first question: how many days before the period of performance ends should you request a letter of material certification? 270 days, 365 days, 515 days, or 600 days? You can go ahead and publish the poll, Tiffany. Perfect. So there's 34 of you. There we go, the responses. That's good. A little more than half of you have responded. Anybody else? Right now, it looks like the popular answer is 270 days. A few people at, well, about a fourth of you at 365. A few people think 515. Okay, Tiffany, you can go ahead and close the poll. So the answer is 515 days. So we'll move on to the next question. And all of these answers you'll see as we go through the training. So plans and specifications need to be in ACC for material certification. Is that true or false? If you could publish that, Tiffany. Your plans need to be in ACC for the lab to give you a letter of material certification. It looks like most people think that's true at this stage of the game. Okay, you can close that poll. Thank you, Tiffany. So the answer is true. Plans do need to be in ACC for material certification. And this is the last question. Which logs are not needed for material certification? And you can pick all that apply. So you can pick more than one answer here. You can go ahead and publish. Very good. Thank you. Thanks, Tiffany. So which logs aren't needed for material certification? RFI, change orders, compaction, or safety inspection? Which ones, one or ones of those you don't need for material cert? It looks like 50% of you say you definitely don't need safety inspections, and about 35% say you don't need RFIs. A couple think you don't need change orders. So you can go ahead and close that poll, Tiffany. Thank you. Thank you all for participating. So you don't need RFIs or safety inspections for your material certification. Okay, so that was the last question for the pretest. I always like to start with the core values of accountability, safety, community, innovation, and teamwork, because it's important to understand the core values and let them guide how you do your work every day, right? That's what core values are about. So the closeout process and materials certification are related to the accountability and teamwork core values. Accountability because you're making sure all of the materials that were incorporated into the project meet the specifications, and you have the documentation to verify that requirements have been met. Teamwork because you are working with the materials testing and research branch or the lab to get the material certification letter for your project. And you can only do that by working together to accomplish it. So accountability and teamwork are the core values here. So a letter of material certification is required on projects with federal funding. Federal funding also has a period of performance. And the period of performance is the time frame you have to spend federal funding on your project. Expenditures outside that time frame are considered ineligible. So let's talk about the timeline for material certification. On the left side of the timeline is substantial completion, so that's the beginning. And on the right side is the end of the period of performance, so that's the end. Knowing when to request material certification is important to ensure that you can close the project by the end of the period of performance, and all your expenditures can then be considered for federal eligibility. So we'll work for this timeline, we'll work backward from the end of the period of performance. Fiscal requires 120 days or 4 months to do their work to close the project. Closing of consultant contracts takes 40 days. Final acceptance and final payment take another 85 days to complete. Once the material testing and research branch, the lab, has all the required documents, it takes an average of 270 days to provide a letter of material certification. You'll notice the asterisk on the 270 days. This process is evolving. And as of today, SOCRATA and the Justification of Construction Performance Period, or the JCPP, aren't current. So if you have any questions about how long you should allow for materials certification, ask your supervisor. Altogether, this totals 515 days, and you'll remember that that was the answer. So you want to request your letter for material certification more than 18 months ahead of the period of the end of the period of performance. So it's probably earlier than you thought it needed to be. So it's probably worth mentioning here that if you need to extend the period of performance date, you must request the extension 3 months before the end of the POP. So there isn't a lapse in federal eligibility. So let's take a quick look at the deadlines in PSS so you can see the timeline for a POP extension. So let's start at the bottom and work our way to the top. 180 days before the period of performance expires, the POP extension date turns red in PSS. At this point, you need to determine if a POP extension is needed. The question you need to ask yourself is, will all your closeout activities be completed in the next 60 days and moved to fiscal for closeout? So that includes the material cert, utility agreements, the post-design consultant contracts, as-built are posted, final payment processed. All of that needs to be completed in the next 60 days and moved to fiscal for closeout. If the answer is yes, you can move, all of that's going to hit that mark, then you don't need an extension. If the answer is no for any one of those items, then you'll need to request an extension. And you need to ask for the extension 90 days or 3 months before the end of the period of performance. You'll use the JCPP to determine what your adjusted period of performance should be. And you should submit that to Highway A and to FHWA Hawaii Division. So now back to the timeline. You submit your request for a letter of material certification as soon after substantial completion as possible, and 515 days before the end of the performance period, or the end of the performance period of performance. When you submit your request for the letter for the material certification, there is a lot of information you need to include. The project summary of materials report. All of your JC cards need to be in headlight. You need to provide your change orders. Your plans and specifications and the compaction logs should be in ACC. And lastly, you need to provide the latest progress payment with quantities. It's important for you to provide the appropriate person in the lab with access to your project in ACC so that they can see your documents. We'll walk through each of these documents, but there's something you need to understand to make your project closeout as painless as possible. This is a famous quote by Jack Nicholson from the movie A Few Good Men. You can't handle the truth. If you're under 35, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. But the truth you may or may not be able to handle is closeout starts the day the project begins. And I'm sure you've heard this. You need to begin with the end in mind so you set yourself up for success. At least someone has heard that quote before. That's great. Jack Nicholson's a classic. Okay, so the project summary of materials is the first document you need to include with your request for material certification. Think of it as an X-ray of your project. Materials are the skeleton, the backbone of your project. The summary of materials is the tool that helps you monitor the health of what is central to your project. You want to fill in the materials summary before the project starts. Fill in the pay item number and description, any comments you may have, the section in the lab that will test the sample for that pay item, and the number of samples needed based on the planned quantities. The rest you'll fill in as you take samples during construction. Again, to set yourself up for success, fill in the project summary of materials before the project begins. Then once construction starts, you want to enter all your materials, sampling, and testing information in Headlight daily. You want to provide all the required certificates of compliance daily as you get them. You want to enter them the day you get them. You want to review test results as they come in every day. And then you want to explain, justify, and resolve any rejected samples as you get those results. You want to do that the day they come in as well. So you want to keep this project summary of materials up to date so you can understand the health of your project. The other documents that you need to submit with your request for a letter of material certification are the plans and specs should be uploaded in ACC. You need to provide your change orders. You need to provide the compaction logs in ACC and the most recent pay estimate with quantities. For pay estimates, you can save copies in ACC under files, or if you're part of the pilot, you will have progress payments in Headlight. All of this information needs to be available in ACC and or submitted to the lab and be complete before their 270 days will start. Remember to provide access to the appropriate person or people in the lab to your project in ACC so they can see your documents. And there's one more best practice here that can help this go smoothly. I'm sure you're thinking, oh, okay, really? Submit the project summary of materials to the lab for review 605 days before the POP ends instead of 515. This is 90 days earlier than you need to request your letter for material certification. Let me tell you why this helps. Submitting your summary of material report early allows the lab to check all your JC cards and ensure everything's complete, to make sure you have the test results for all your samples, enough samples for the project's quantities, and you've addressed any samples with exceptions. It allows you time to make any corrections and gather any information they request so that you can submit everything with your request for letter of certification 515 days before the POP ends. And then the 270 days can start with your request without any delay. Oops, sorry, that was the last slide. So that's the timeline for material certification closeout. So do you have any questions? Are there any? I'm not seeing anything in the chat yet, but I don't know if anybody has any questions about this process. I'm not seeing anybody type.
Arlene, hi, this is Willie.
Hi, Willie.
I have questions since I have some, as you know, I have some experience with HDOT Wahoo.
Yes, yes.
Because you said submit material certification like so many days before POP expiration.
Yep.
But in cases of the projects that I got involved in while at HDOT, the submission of material certification, it depends on when the substantial completion of the project, not the number of days before the POP ending. So it could be substantial completion. As we know, a lot of projects, they don't actually substantially complete per the original scheduled completion. A lot of projects go way past substantially complete, way past the original completion date. So in practical, in actuality, in a lot of projects, material certification are submitted way less than 605 days.
So go back to PSS here, Willie. So you're right. Sometimes there's not that much, there's not 515 days between substantial completion and the end of the POP, right?
Yeah.
So you'll need to track how many days you have because so again, PSS will the The PSS extension date will turn red in PSS when you're 180 days out. So that'll be your first sign. Even if you haven't reached substantial completion, it'll turn red. So that'll be your sign to make sure that you have an extension. So if your substantial completion hasn't come yet at 180 days from the end of the period of performance, then you're going to need to request an extension. And so when you put that information in the JCPP to request your new date, you'll want to keep these timeframes in mind. And make sure that the material certification, you have at least 270 days in there, so that when you request your new POP, it's out far enough based on what your new substantial completion date's going to be. Does that make sense, Willie?
Yeah, but one more thing on this
Mhm.
this screen. When I was at HDOT up until the end of last year, the admin directive, I don't know if it changed since then. The admin directive is when you do a POP extension, it should not be more than 360 days from substantial completion. For the people at HDOT, you guys can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but that's what I remember admin rule or directive was, not more than 360 days.
Not more than 360 days from substantial completion.
So, Willie,
Yeah.
this timeline was vetted through a lot of different venues. So yes, things have changed. And that's why the asterisk says ask your supervisor, because as we prepared for this, it was mostly to make sure people are aware of these timelines. And the asterisk is super important. It says the process is evolving. And if you have questions, check with your supervisor, because the information on Socrata is a little different. But in talking to Federal Highways about durations that are being approved through, POP extensions with Maui and Oahu, that these were the timelines that shook out of that vetting. So bottom line is, yes, I think things have changed since you've left, and I anticipate them to continue to change. So the 1 year is not as big of a deal to admin, and Federal Highways has been accepting other dates. But that could change tomorrow, so.
Okay.
Aha, I saw your hand. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, but I wanted to make sure all the questions were answered. I just wanted
Okay.
to kind of reinforce what Kai said. There's been things happening, but the timelines you guys shown are very sound. You talk about a lead time, right? And such. And what I'm, as the processor of all POPs, and I just looked at Socrata, we're several hundred in at this point. You often see that when there are a good number of them having to do that site material certs as the delay, but when in actuality it's not. It's two things I wanted to point out. A lot of times the delay is upstream, right? So there isn't enough time for the material certification. The 270 days aren't, that are left is what they'll cite in the POP extensions, whereas there was a 6-month delay in construction that really we should be highlighting in the POP extension request, right, as the reason for the delay. And then the extra time you're asking for is going to be used for material cert. So number one, just make sure when we request the POP extension that we're clear on what the delay is. Early on, and more times than I can count, the team might cite, the reason for the delay or reason for the extra time, which is to complete the material certs, but overlook the fact that the delay wasn't lab's fault, right? Wasn't because lab started late or anything. So that's number one. Number two, though, is when I see that they say lab has taken longer than 270 days. I just processed one that claimed it was 500 days. Well, turns out a lot of the things you talked about today, and you encourage as best practices didn't happen, right? Where they maybe sent in a partial cert and didn't send in all the information, thought they did, never followed up, and assumed their 270 days started. Kind of like you said, if you submit it early, lab will tell you, and you communicate with lab, they'll tell you when something's missing, and then they'll tell you when the 270 days start. So mostly wanted to highlight those 2 points, because I see it a lot. Yeah, when I process the POPs, is that folks will not get everything into lab that they need to start their 270-day process, and then think that the material certification process has started. And when it takes too long, they say it's not our fault. It's lab's fault. So I've been through that process two more times than I think, or a lot of times, enough to say, make sure you're communicating with lab early. So that's my two. I don't know. I hope I was clear. Right. Make sure you cite the real delay when it comes to requesting extension, and make sure you recognize that the 270 days doesn't start until lab has everything they need. So that 60-day lead time you guys talked about seems like would address a lot of the things I've seen that have happened when it came to, material certifications not being processed in a timely manner.
Thank you. So, Marvin, we do understand that there's still some coordination that needs to happen between Highway C, Highway A, and Highway D to get everybody on the same timeline for setting the period of performance date at the beginning of a project. So we're still, that process is still being worked on. We understand that all that coordination does need to take place. Any other questions?
I had a quick question.
Sure.
Hey, Arlene.
Hey.
So if I guess if we're in our construction, and if the project looks like it's pushing out or delaying, let's just say hypothetically it's due to the contractor not basically it's contractor owned delay. Would that be a reason enough to do a POP extension, or like if we were to catch it early enough, do we do it early, or do we kind of wait? I mean, knowing that we have still a lot of time left on the contract, is it better to try to get that POP extension done as you're seeing the schedule push out? Or I was just curious on like what the recommendation is if you're in that situation.
I'm going to let you answer that, Kahaha, if you would.
Yes, no problem. Good question. I get it every now and again. But Arlene, I want to highlight your timeline. I think I have your PDF open. Correct me if I'm wrong. It says 180 days out from the POP decision date to ask for a POP extension. I think that's pretty safe. I guess the short answer to the question is no. You don't want to ask for a POP extension once at the time while the delay is happening. If I heard you correct, Arlene, you guys suggested 180 days out to evaluate. I think that is wise. When a delay happens, we know they happen. What you got to do is document them well to your change order summary, your summary of a change order logs that you guys use that Highway C has on their wiki site. Because when that 6 months out, when you do look at whether or not you have a POP extension, you'll be able to refer to that documentation and ask, and the asking for the extension should be an easy lift. The reason you want to wait until around that time is you may run into multiple change orders, right? With multiple delays. When you're 180 days out, you probably have a better idea of how much extra time you need, right? Because everything else is spelled out. The 270 days for material cert, the 120 days for fiscal. So, I hope I'm being clear. You don't want to you don't want to ask for an extension every time a change order happens. You want to ask for it some set period out. 180 days seems to be a good amount of lead time, because by that time you will have been able to, you know, figure out how much extra time you've awarded the contractor, you may award the contractor, and then you do, you know, you figure out that amount, you add on these other set times that are needed for, you know, critical path steps, and then you come up with your updated POP end date, and you go through the process. You get with highway, you put together your draft, get with highway A, and then you submit it.
Gotcha. That's helpful. I guess the one piece I'm still trying to figure out is what if there is no change order warranted? So if the delays are solely owned by the contractor, would that be a justification that you could use to extend the POP, or is it?
Number one, yes, right?
Okay.
I'll answer as the easy answer is yes. However, right, contractually, if you're giving more time, somehow you got to document that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Either in a statement of working days, you know, or help me here. I know you guys go by assigning days, but I guess
I
in the
think, Joel,
JCP,
let me
you would
jump in
highlight,
there,
help me
'cause-
there.
Yeah, because he's saying we wouldn't be contractually extending the date, right?
Yeah.
So
That's
you could be showing it in your weekly statement of working days and then provide justification. So in that case, the contractor would be an LD.
right.
So yeah, and that's
Yes.
fine, Joel. You just have to write up your justification, whatever it is, and
Okay.
and support it with ideally the schedule that shows that, and then you can write a narrative that says what the schedule is saying, and you can add a weekly summary. And I think that's when this class is more about the material certification closeout part. So maybe we need to split off and just do a POP extension closeout kind of thing. So that's why, the process is a little fluid with durations. So you work with your supervisor or the resident engineer, construction engineer. And at that time, as Kaha'a mentioned, as you get closer to the end of the project, working with those parties, you're definitely going to be consulting with Kaha'a on what your supporting documentation looks like. But yes, anything that pushes out the project is a justification. It's just a matter of how your narrative is written up and what the extension looks like. And to the point of this class right now, we're just talking about these are the durations you should be factoring in to that POP process. But obviously, this is general instruction. So as you get closer, work with your supervisor, work with your DOT counterpart, yada yada, and they will be working with Kaha'a. So
Yeah, I want to just affirm what Kai said, everything. And in the end, you guys just doing your business out there, documenting well. That's what I asked for. And when it comes time for PP extension, I just want a snapshot, right? Key documents, statement of work, and an updated schedule. And I'm just really wanting some documents to capture what you guys did, so you guys can keep moving on, right? We don't got to make up any new documents or new material, like Kai said, captured in the narrative. And yep, I agree that this is a material cert class. I think I'm not surprised POP is coming up, because when POPs come up, material certs get pointed at real quickly, right? So that's why I wanted to highlight that. And Joe, you're right on, right? When the delays happen, they're happening in construction, but because the material cert process is 270 days, and because finance is another 120 days following that, that's 13 months, right? At the end, that's always need to happen no matter what. So that's 13 months of delay that can happen during a project without you yet needing to take any official federal action. So, Joe, thank you for bringing the question up, in the sense that you're reminding the team that just go through your guys' processes, do the change orders, do whatever you got to do, document it well, and then ask for that extension. Because as this class is pointing out, there's no shorter duration than 270. That I've learned for the last 3 years. Every time somebody went to admin to rush lab or to rush the finance team through, to shorten their processes, very, very few times have they ever made lab or made the finance team rush. And when they did make it rush, it was usually George asking for it. So make the team do something quicker. So that's the biggest takeaway. And it does highlight the fact that you guys then need to keep track of what's happening in construction. so that you can ask for it later, because those are protected periods. Again, can't emphasize Arlene's recommend or Highway C's recommended 60-day lead time for that 270. I feel like that would fix a lot of misunderstandings. And then again, one last thing I want to highlight what Arlene said is, what does it say? I have it up here. Closeout starts the closeout starts the day the project begins. As a guy who gets to see the projects from cradle to grave, right? The as-builts, what happens during and after, and when it doesn't happen during, when the utility agreement conversations don't happen at the right time, and when the material cert processes don't happen in the field in a, the way they should, it all culminates at the end. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks,
Is that
guys.
you, Kai? All right, great stuff. Thanks, Arlene.
You're welcome. Thank you, Ka. Okay, so I have a post test, of course, right? Just to make sure that we all got it. So as a best practice, we just talked about best practice. How many days before POP expiration should you request a letter of material certification? 270 days, 365 days, 455 days, or 605 days? If you would publish that poll, Tiffany. Thank you. About half of you have responded. It looks like we're split here. Okay, Tiffany, you can go ahead and close that poll. The answer is 605 days. That includes that 90 days so that you can submit your material summary report to the lab to have them check that over and see if there's any tests that are missing or anything else that you need. Okay, the next question is, does the appropriate person in the materials testing and research branch or the lab, do they need access to ACC to provide a material certification? Yes, no, or maybe? You can publish that poll, Tiffany. You can go ahead and close the poll, Tiffany. So about half of you answered and everybody got it right. The answer is yes. They need to have access to ACC so they can see your plans and specifications and your compaction logs and anything else that you used ACC to submit for. Which logs are needed for material certification? And you can pick all that apply here. Which ones are needed for material certification? And if you would publish that poll, Tiffany. Select all that apply. Excellent. Excellent, excellent. You can go ahead and close that poll, Tiffany. Thank you. Change orders and compaction logs. Everybody got that right as well. Very good. And then I have one more question just to get some feedback. So how would you rate the usefulness of the training content today? Not at all useful, somewhat useful, adequate, useful, or very useful? That's just to help me understand if I'm hitting the mark for what you need in this kind of training. If you would publish that, Tiffany. And then that's all we have for today. So after you answer the feedback, you can sign off, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you for the conversation and the participation. I appreciate it very much. So you can stop the recording, Josh.
Yeah, Lee, can I ask you a question after most everybody signs off?